Okay, good evening. I'd like to motion to resume regular session here.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carried. Okay, so at this time, could everyone stand for the pledge followed by a moment of silence? Brian, could you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, this time I'd like a motion and a second to approve the board meeting agenda, please.
I'll move it.
Bill? Second by Ray. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. Okay, this time item 3A is the appointment of Judith Schneider as NICET Special Education Impartial Hearing Officer for case ID number 551215. I'll need a motion and a second to bring this to the floor.
I'll move it.
Second.
Bill and Flo? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. At this time, entertain a motion and a second to adjourn the meeting.
I'll move it.
Brian?
Second.
Ray? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries. So we'll take about a 5-minute recess and we'll enter the budget workshop. The next meeting of the Board of Education will be Tuesday, April 13th at 7 p.m. here in the high school cafeteria.
We'll just go ahead and begin with, really the goal tonight, absent of a budget being passed by New York State, would have been beneficial, certainly, in many regards, as early as possible. April 1st is the deadline. But that being said, we'll provide just some information and where we stand as far as some of the federal funding, some of the state funding, and really just at that point, just an open dialogue with the board and really just fielding any questions that you may have. So Mr. Lenz, I know you wanted to go over a couple items, inclusive of one thing that's in their red folder.
Yeah, that is correct. One of the items in your red folder this evening is really a fact sheet around the federal funding that is coming our way. And I'm sure that many are aware, based on some of the elected officials putting out numbers, that we are set to receive about $7.2 million. It's important to note that we will have 2 years to use that funding, and then it will no longer exist. So we will have to, use all of that money over those 2 years, or I'm sure lose it. It's going to be important that we really have a lot of dialogue and we make decisions around those funds, that we don't end up having a large gap after those 2 years end, because if we were to use those funds towards creating new positions, we're going to have to know and build in money that we're going to be able to continue paying those positions 2 years later. So it's critical that we don't put in things that are going to be long-standing expenses. However, some of the central theme with this is to relief around the gap that's been created around COVID or coronavirus for students. And so we have already talked about bolstering our summer school program. That's one of the things that's mentioned in here, and we certainly have after school and before school programming in a traditional year, and we certainly can look at those types of things, because that's not creating long-term positions. The other piece that is happening concurrently is the state budget that we were hoping would be passed on time and we could have in-depth conversations this evening. But the state did release today that they apparently did come to a deal with the Assembly and Senate majority leaders, along with the governor. And so it is announced that they are going to increase education spending actually by $3 billion. But it's also important to note that $3 billion includes expense-based aids, so some of that is capital expenses, some of it's transportation expenses. So while that number is increasing that number, some of that is just to go towards expenses that are really already known. But the foundation aid is supposed to be increasing $1.4 billion. And one of the things that is out there as far as the formula, as I know at this time, is that it's supposed to increase 2%. And for Port Jervis, that means about $650,000 of additional funding. So that's the minimum that they were talking about. Again, without seeing the final budget bill, I'm not sure that that's what's in there, but if I look at history, I'll also be honest with you that it looks like that could yield about $1 million of additional funding for us. But I say those numbers, but they're far from written in stone without actually seeing a state aid run and what that means for us. Because there's a lot of different things that can happen with state aid and how they send that money across all the school districts in New York State. So even though I'm looking at history, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be spread out the same way that it's been in the past. So it is positive news in the sense that that number, closes really, even at the $650,000 number, really much of the gap that we were talking about last time that we met. Because we were talking about a $700,000 number, and so that is positive news because if it is a larger number, we're in a pretty good predicament. And one of the other things that we talked about last time we were together is the tax levy increase, and that's always an important aspect of the revenue side. And it's important to reflect on the current situation that has been created by this virus, and also the additional funds that are coming, but also again keeping in mind really just that short-term and long-term picture of some of these funds are only going to be available for a couple of years, and then we're going to have to look to the general fund to continue some of those expenses. And that's really much of my report this evening, because that's really much of what we know at this stage until the state actually puts out the runs, which I would anticipate will happen in the next couple days, because once the budget bills make it to the floor of the Assembly and Senate, they will put out the aid run for the schools. But until we see those, we really don't know what's coming our way. But unfortunately, it is a political process. So depending on who's in the majority and where they are will actually determine how much state aid comes our way.
So while you may be mulling over some questions or developing questions, I do want to also point out just something that Mr. Lenz stated and then repeated and bears repeating again is how cautious one needs to be, right? When you hear $7.2 million, certainly that is welcomed revenue to any school district, but we have to be very cautious in how we're utilizing it, but also in maximizing what the return on investment for those funds are. So we are, in addition to waiting for more guidance, I personally am anticipating that the funds will probably be released in a manner similar to our title grants. So for example, for Title I, you fill out a form, FS10, you fill out this form that explains your budget, basically. This is what we're going to use X amount of dollars for, and break it down in a narrative. And then if it's approved, then you get the money and so forth. So I anticipate that being the case. I go into the weeds on this, and I'll leave it at that point, but I wanted to just accentuate that if that is the case, we may be looking at, and we are looking at different options, basically the Rubik's Cube of how to maximize that $7.2 million, knowing that it's not in perpetuity, it's not something that we'll continue to get. But we may put some salaries in or some compensation pieces into that for the 2 years that we're allowed to, thereby taking the money out of other areas in like our general fund to then maximize that, because maybe that fits what the Relief Act allows for, and maybe something else that we feel as a learning community doesn't. And again, I don't wanna get into too far down a rabbit hole unnecessarily, but I just wanted to be fully transparent. Mr. Lynn says we have to be cautious about, staffing, but what he said is really adding positions, right? Because you may see in some news reports that, there are plans to increase the number of counselors or other positions in a school district. Understand those now become long-term costs, and we are doing analysis on those as well as to retirements, potential retirements in the future, how many potential years out, and all those other things to extrapolate it. But nonetheless, we're exercising great caution and saying we're using that money for funding. So again, I'm sorry for going off on a tangent there, but I just wanted to be fully transparent, but also say there's a lot of nuances to that money to maximize it, and also potentially allow it to grow also in the form of aid in the future based on what you use that money for. So you turn that $7.2 million theoretically into $7.2 million plus the aid that you're receiving in subsequent years for those purchases.
So would it be safe to say that without making plans for long-term positions, i.e. staffing, it would be safe to say that from that 7.2 million, maybe towards the infrastructure of the district, helping with, Wi-Fi bandwidth and investing in technology of that sort, that would be something that it would be an improvement across, that would be a viable investment.
That is one of the options,
Okay.
That we certainly will look at, just as well as devices and all of those things, and we will do our best to maximize funds. One of the things that we look at in our purchases is traditionally we're buying Chromebooks through BOCES. Why? Because that generates BOCES aid. And you can't use grant funds for that because then you won't get the aid. So it's always looking and doing that balance of shifting things around to make sure that we're getting the best dollar for our taxpayer. Just really getting some return on that money. So that dollar just became another 70 cents that we now have in our hands that we can spend on something for the children of this district and to the benefit of the taxpayer.
To put it in a form that equates to where I was going with, let's say we were to take 2 staff members that are in a building, let's say the high school, that's not a Title I building, right? So we don't have them built into our Title I grants. We take 2 of those positions, put the salary into this funding, and then we do just what Mr. Lenz was saying, and we purchase Chromebooks as part of our replacement plan. We now can get aid on that money, where had we purchased those Chromebooks through the grant funding, we would not get aid. So I'm thinking that makes sense, but that's where we're looking at it. And yeah, what it also allows is for the things you were saying, Ray, and then also if there's any sort of capital outlay projects that would generate aid, other capital outlay projects, and then there are expenses like the number of Chromebooks that our IT department had to purchase over the past couple of years as part of that replacement cycle. That money was budgeted for. What that allows for, now we can forecast out a few more years and say, well, we'll have that money in our general fund because we're taking care of something that we were looking at doing 3 years from now. We can now do it in the next 2 years with this money, thereby allowing so we don't have to sustain a hit on that year. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, but trust me, it's a welcomed game that we have. It's not that it's a game, but it's a welcomed puzzle. It's better than trying to figure out the puzzle of a $7.2 million deficit. I'm assure you of that.
Thank you.
And so with all of that being said, with this additional funding, I brought up the tax levy. And we had a conversation the last time, and we were focused, and I would say that the result was 1% or less. And so, knowing that there is additional funding potentially coming our way with regards to the federal money as well as the state, I'm sure the board is going to want to have a discussion of a different number.
Yes.
Given that change, and certainly understand them. Yes.
Okay, I just have a comment, maybe a comment and question. Mr. Lynch, what you had said before about, this new funding is not like grants, and grants to me, I'm sorry, when you do a grant, they're gonna end and you're gonna pay for it over and over and over again. And to get this money, to do it a one or two time thing, maybe whatever this is your job, this is your forte, it's not mine. But just tell you that this community, Port Jervis, Deer Park, who pays their taxes here, who votes, has done this district very well. New building that we have waited for, I've waited for, I can't tell you how long, the middle school. And they were behind you when they came out and they approved it. And maybe something with lowering the taxes also, maybe something else that the middle school might need that wasn't in the funding, would be one-time shot to do something like that. I don't know, I'm just saying. But please, when we think about this community who was behind you and all the votes that passed, that you got whatever you needed with budgets especially, and then with the middle school coming up, because I can't wait for that to start, that's gonna be a blessing in itself. And I know it's gonna be cat and mouse, a little here, a little there, up here, down there, but whatever you do, I know as a board we'll sit and we'll chew it up, take it out, spit it out, whatever we have to do to come to what the whole district and the district needs, not only our voters and our seniors, but what our kids need to for the rest of our time here, educating them. And I thank you, thanks for all your work.
Bill, did you have something?
No, actually, Mike answered my question in his narrative
Yeah,
okay.
of the technology.
Taxes and taxes.
Annette?
know something. So, like, one of the things I was thinking about was, I know that there has been a lot of learning loss in a lot of our children. There are kids in the same family. One child excelled at the home instruction and the virtual learning, and the other child fell way behind because of their difference, and every child is different. So when you were talking about, like, possibility of, say, hiring a couple of, say, psychologists, extra psychologists, or somebody who would be doing the testing of the students to see if they needed extra, emotional support or whatever, and then you're talking about looking out at the retirement, so that when we're hiring them, it would actually be replacing somebody that in the next 5 years, say, might be considering retirement. So it really wouldn't be a big burden on the district as, am I understanding that correctly?
You are, it's, you're certainly, you're forecasting out to the best of your ability. So to use your scenario, yeah, if you had a position, let's just make up a fictional position of position A, and it's gonna provide, service Y, right? That, and you say, okay, while long-term, we would not want to have an extra person in that position at this time as a bridge to, what we need to overcome, then certainly, and we forecast that in 3 years, 3 to 4 years, we expect there to be a vacancy in that position. Yeah, you're filling it before it actually became a vacancy, and then you're not filling the retirement through attrition, right, so to speak.
Right.
So,
Give
yeah,
the
that.
children what they need now, because they need it now.
That's absolutely a fair play, and the other piece is, when you talk about like the summer programming, we're committed to, we've been expanding the summer program for the past several years, and we'll expand it once again to whatever level we can get the students in the buildings, and also expanding the opportunities. Mr. Pantaleone has some really some great ideas that are drafted out to really make it more of almost a full day program, but not just full day in the classroom, a lot of other supports, which go to your point, Linda, and also on the physical education and athletic realms, right? Because it's not lost on me that maybe some students weren't as active this past year, and I'm all about academics, I'm all about the arts, but athletics are a huge portion of everyone's,
Good
life
health.
in some regard, and
Really
and that's
good
something
health.
that's also part of it, and Nick deserves a lot of credit for really just trying to figure out every nuance of summer program. So again, going down the rabbit hole, I apologize. That also is going to translate into next school year. So while we're shying away from using this to create positions per se, we are definitely going to be using this funding to create opportunities for our current staff to do the things that they do best and that they love to do, and provide those services for our students, and really take it the expanded school year, expanded school day, expanded school year concept, and just opening it wide open.
I mean, in addition to that, I think Mr. Ardell captured it very well. And he spoke about opportunities. Something else that we're looking to expand is also really the use of our instructional technology platforms to really perform diagnostic tests, specifically IXL and DataMate Elite, to look at how students are doing and benchmarking throughout the year, and really use that time to collect data to really identify gaps and give targeted support. Along with that, to give mapping opportunities and also support, like in formerly the Stream Enrichment program that we're still doing, but some more targeted support through AAS services before and after school as well.
Thank you, that was very good.
Now I understand it better.
Good.
So I might as well say, and several have said it before, but where we're at right now, can we get, I have mixed feelings about a zero. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I know a lot of people are saying the taxpayers on a zero increase.
Can you please,
There's a big difference
Debbie,
between.
can you please speak in the mic?
Oh, yeah, sorry. There's a big
Difference between the tax levy increase and, what's the other word I'm looking for? The actual tax increase.
Tax rate.
The tax rate, and it's all really dependent upon the equalization rate in the different communities, which we have nothing to do with. So, while we could go out and say it's a zero tax rate and pray that it is a true zero, we all have to be mindful of the fact that it may not be a true zero, right? It may go up, it could go up if the equalization rates are changed. And then you're really gonna hurt yourself going down the road, because your zero then turns into a negative the following year when it comes to the tax cap. I'm not saying I'm opposed to that, I just think it's something we need to be really mindful of. Our taxpayers have been very supportive of us, and, I'll be the first one to tell you, I'd love to see my tax bill. My tax bill did go down a little last year, but I just think that's something we need to keep in the backs of our minds. And if if in the end we think we can support the zero, then I think we should go for the zero. But just keep that in mind as we're working through this, that the zero does not necessarily mean the taxes are going down, and it could result in problems down the road with zero and our tax cap. That's my only concern.
And that has happened before.
Yeah.
And that is something that absolutely has to be a part of the discussion, and you said that very right, Debbie, in that, if we put out a zero, the equalization rates, I will tell you, will change, which means that, in our district in particular, Port Jervis and Deer Park are the largest, groups that, make up our community, so those really impact what the results of the tax rate are, because of those equalization rate changes. And what does an equalization rate change mean? It's really just trying to equalize what the real value of your home is according to the state. And so, houses are selling for more, and so those rates, I'm sure, are going to fluctuate slightly this coming year. And if Port Jervis changes a little bit more than Deer Park does, then it potentially could push the taxes a little higher in Port Jervis versus Deer Park, because as far as the equation is concerned, it appears like there's more value in Port Jervis, which is why the taxes will go up a little bit more in Port Jervis, because the formula is saying there's more value there, which means there's either new homes or the value in that area is higher, so they should pay a little more on the taxes. And that's why that fluctuation just keeps happening, is based on those, valuations. And then to your point of a zero, our expenses always, tend to increase because benefit costs increase. We all have the experience around health insurance and what that does. And so we do have to always be mindful of what that long-term impact of a zero, because in this year, we certainly will have, increase in expenses. And if we do have enough state aid that comes and closes that gap, for this year, down the road, if state aid doesn't increase at the same rate, we could be looking at a potential larger increase of a tax rate or tax levy in the future, to support that ongoing increase that just naturally happens in a budget. So there can be a benefit today. Sometimes that does have an impact later, just like all decisions. Decisions you make now do have an impact at a later date. And that doesn't mean that we can't consider that. It just means that it has to be something that we truly discuss and make sure we're comfortable with.
I think, from a public point of view, and the question that's come to me by several of the taxpayers is, you're getting a benefit, why shouldn't we get a benefit from it? Because as we discussed the last meeting, you still got people not back at work. You still have people that are just hanging on right now. And, to them, a zero would mean, a lot to them, And I understand that sometimes your taxes only go up $100 or whatever that number may be, but it's $100. As it compounds over the years, it ends up being a lot of money.
I could understand what Mr. Onifrey says, because I know majority of us was here in the 2004 budget increase of the 32%, and that I've never gotten over, and that's why I'm still here. But I said it before, and I'll talk to town of Deerpark, that's where I live. If nobody knows that, that's where I live. We went down to zero, and then we went down below zero in our taxes, in our budget. It can happen. That's why you do your job. That's why we hired you. That's why next year, I'm just saying if it does happen this year, to throw something at the community and your residents to say, thank you for everything you've done for us, we're gonna use this much money next, and I understand it's all the formulas and don't understand the formulas, and you have the formulas to work with, but work with us, work with our seniors, work with our veterans, work with everybody, that you could throw a little bit more into the budget mix. And you know what? Throw the cards up, whatever happens next year, we start again from next year. That's how I feel. Getting this 7.2 million, I think we should do something like that for all our residents that have been here, going along with us and voting for us and having things happen here that we've always asked them for.
And those are all perfect points. I would just, that's why we have to have those discussions and consider, doing what is necessary for the public, and just making sure that, we have it planned out. To your point, Flo, that is my job, and we will make it work, in the short term and long term.
Right, thank you. I know.
And to your point, Flo, and what Joe was alluding to, because we have these conversations often, so sometimes maybe I hear a nuance in something he says, and maybe it's missed. We're not against that. What we're talking about is being fully transparent, right? If you go out with a zero, and I'm hesitant to say, well, when a community goes, when a school district goes out with a zero, it's a sign of gratitude, right? I think it's a sign of planning and being able to, but understanding how that could impact the future. We feel that it's our responsibility to provide the board with the if-then. If we go out with a zero, then this is what we have to be very cognizant of in the future. I will also tell you, from my personal opinion, if there's ever a year to go out with a zero, this is the year,
Right.
right? So, and then, like you said, it's on us to make sure that we have this planned out for the foreseeable future, and then say, okay, you know, to the Board of Education, this is, if we go out with a zero, this is what a couple of years from now could look like, or this is how we think, things could play out. So the answer to that question is, yes, we have a decent idea of where that is, based on the whole gamut of numbers that we've spoken about as far as percentages go. So the short answer is, we don't disagree with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
You're welcome. Are there additional questions or comments? I know that's the biggest thing, right, is tax levy, but to just come right out with that and without other dialogue is really, it does not bear any fruit, and it's, there are a lot of moving parts to this, but I did think it was, well, we thought it was important, the three of us thought it was important to really cover that 7.2 million. Well, it does not, it's not longstanding, and it's, you know, it will be utilized. It's important for the.
Only 1 of 9.
It's fine, I was probably talking too much, so I'll stop there.
So I think sadly, we're just also still in a holding pattern to see what comes down from Albany.
Yeah, and so when we, you know, meet next week, we certainly should have more definitive numbers, and that, like I said, I would expect to see state aid runs in the next couple of days, now that they've apparently agreed on the budget. So once we see those numbers, then it's, you know, it's much easier to put a final spending plan together, which is then based on the revenue that we can truly anticipate coming, versus right now I'm looking at history and trying to make some assumptions off of what is being talked about in news reports.
And Mr. Lenz can like downplay how in tune he is with it, but he has the window clearly defined based on, you know, everything that he knows. So, you know, we have a very good idea of where the lowest end is, and we also have a guess as to where things may actually end up in that. It's a few $100,000 range, but that few $100,000 is a few $100,000.
What is 1%?
1% on our budget is how much?
On our levy?
On our levy.
On our levy at this point, it's about almost 290.
219. Okay.
290.
29, almost 300.
Almost
Okay.
300.
And that could be about the difference between the low end and the high end of what, you know, could be forecasted. So we plan for the low end, and then really that, with the low end, and that's still with no real tax levy increase factored into that. No, was not a play on words, it was no veil in there. I just mean, we have that range, so if it was within 0 to 0.33, we know we're at about $100,000 window there. We also know where we could then remove $100,000 from the budget and put it into title grants. Because unlike the grants that Flo is referring to, the title grants aren't necessarily something you're applying for and then will be used up, i.e. Emerson and I were pursuing a grant for hotspots for our students, a 2-year grant to provide hotspots for students, and that way if we have 3 children in the same house working off a hotspot, we can give each of them a hotspot, right? They each get their own. That would be a grant, that would be a kind of a one and done. After those 2 years, you're on your own. Do you continue to buy those hotspots, et cetera? I will tell you the bad news that we were informed that we're probably not going to get the grant, but nonetheless, that would be an example of that type of grant.
What you try?
Oh, we try very hard. That's those grants.
Those are the things that,
Those
you know,
add up.
don't
That is
do.
money that you're not utilizing
Right.
your other sources of revenue for. I look at it as a source of revenue. We're not using taxpayer money for that, and you know, meanwhile, we did have to purchase several contracts of hotspots for our students because our students needed them. that's without knowing that there was going to be some COVID-related funding that could
Yeah.
assist us with that.
Are there any other questions?
I think we're kind of in limbo until we have real solid numbers. I mean, you know, you can only guess.
Well, the budget supposedly is passed, so they give us the numbers, right? And supposedly passed today.
Well, right, the majority leaders and the governor have come up with a number, but it's gotta go to the floor. It's my understanding they're supposed to be printing the bills today and voting on it this evening, but there's like 11 different budget bills that they have to vote on.
So if we stay up late enough tonight, we might know the results of the state aid round.
Yeah, you can let us know.
Maybe.
We'll check first thing in the morning.
Yeah, they'll do that at 3 o'clock in the morning, so they can slip a bunch of things in that have
That's
nothing
what
to do with
they're
it.
doing. They always do that.
So just to be clear for the board, I mean, I know it seems like we're in limbo, but these conversations, not to try to just be nice and say this, but it's meaningful. We take a lot from these conversations, so, you know, we're not necessarily in limbo, because now it gives us a clear idea in talking with the entire board. This is the direction we wanna go, and then now we make it happen and tell you the if-then statements from there. So, not completely limbo from our perspective. I think you'd agree, right, Joe?
I definitely agree, because it's much easier to put together a budget proposal for them to consider that is gonna be something that you wanna consider versus making changes at the last minute.
I just have one more thing that's actually
Sure.
more of a question than, and it's actually in reference to the building project. You know, knowing full well what the increase has been in cost of materials and stuff, you know, do we have any kind of idea what those increased material prices may do to our project, or?
So I'll tell you what it's doing to the planning of the project. It's making it so that there are multiple tiers to it, as you would expect.
Right.
Where you're looking at what did this cost pre-COVID, which is when the original estimates, right? That's
Right.
basically what it is. And now that we're getting into the stages where bidding would actually come into play, ironically, I just received the building permit for the first phase, which is really just the one of the simplest phases, which is repointing the brick at the middle school, which will make it look very nice, right? But that's nonetheless a relatively small part of this project. But that is the concern from all portions of our bi-weekly meetings,
Yeah.
is, you know, where could the bids come in? And if they come in at a certain area for different parts, what would we change? And one of the things that came up was looking at the geothermal piece. And so the work on that, the construction manager said, we expect that to come in higher than what was originally estimated. Some of the components of that, you have to remember that's an entire, basically HVAC unit for a 3-story building. So I'm not a construction person per se, but it's very clear when they're explaining all this to us. And then you look at, well, what are the actual savings from now spending on a more expensive option that just went up X%, right, as would any other HVAC, and then how long would it take to then get that money back? Because that was really the concept of the geothermal,
Right.
was
The long-term recovery.
the long-term recovery. Then you look at, well, best case scenario, that might be 20 years, but now we just drove up the cost of the capital project. So that's a big part of our conversations now, are what are the alternatives? And again, I hate to keep going back to the if-then statements, but it's, if this is where the bids come in. So right now, we have multiple proposals, so when they bid on the projects, they're actually bidding on a project, then alt A and alt B, or alt 1 and alt 2, however, but they're basically
Right.
the two
I know what you're
alternatives, yeah. And again, that level of work just, it just added to all the planning stages.
Which drives the cost of the planning.
Funny you should say that, because that's what the architects then bring
Right.
up, is that, you know, you understand with all this. And then I also, I'm employed by the school district, right?
Right.
This is, at the end of the day, I don't wanna come across as overly aggressive, but this is business at a certain point. So, you know, we met with the architect, and they were saying how this was going to be substantial amount of work. And then I did, in a nice way, explain that we didn't make the estimate, right? The estimate that came out was not generated from my office, nor would that be my role. And we didn't have anything to do with the pandemic. So, all that being said, I think there's a level of responsibility on everyone to make sure that this comes to fruition. So the short answer, I'll wrap it up with, is absolutely it could impact things, but it doesn't impact to the extent that we're not moving forward with this.
No, I understand.
And we're going to then make, you know, we have to make decisions on, okay, this is what we would have liked to have done, and this is what we wouldn't. And again, not to get into too many details, but I'll give you another for example. In that budget, in the original budget, was classroom furniture. Well, we already had a plan to purchase classroom furniture over the course of these next couple of years anyway. We started 3 years ago. Well, some of this funding that we're getting, in addition to what was already in the budget, that's not necessary for that capital project budget. That allows us to, that there's a, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small bit of cushion. But those cushions, like everything else, add up to help us weather that differential. And some of the contingency monies that were put in there just for these types of occurrences, so.
So as we go along, we'll know what the deductions in the project will be, correct?
Yes, well, more in what decisions are being made in order to make this happen, right? So
Yeah.
when the original plans came out, we had certain ideas of what potentially the gymnasium could look like, right? And again, you want the absolute best for your students and the best for the community and another opportunity. Well, maybe you have to then say, okay, square footage, because that's a huge addition that's not aidable, because it is an addition. Then we can't get the size of the bleachers that I had originally wanted, right? Because I have certain things that I say I would like to see in this building, and then we have all the teachers that came to our meetings and say, we would want this, we want that. And then at a certain point, you have to make some concessions.
Right.
Most recently, the concession was, and again, when it's all said and done, one may not actually know that it was a concession, but my original plan was to have stands that would probably exceed the capacity of what's at the high school, because I think a community our size could utilize another indoor competition space such as that. It would still be a full-size gym, so, yeah.
I mean, nobody would have predicted that. Plywood, just plywood alone is almost triple.
Well, I mean, just in general, the cost of building a home has gone from $175 a square foot to $250.
Right.
You know, so a $200,000 home is now $400, $425.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah,
So
you
I'm
know,
very aware of, you know,
Sure.
what you're up against with this.
absolutely, and then, you know, and then it really comes down to, in the bidding process of, you know, how many entities are really looking for work, right?
Right.
And what they're willing to bid on that and so forth, so, yeah.
And that's the amazing thing right now, Mike. It's incredible how busy every contractor is right now, even with the costs at what they are.
Yeah, that's true.
Buildings go crazy.
Our capital project,
Buildings go crazy.
notwithstanding, I'm happy to hear that, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, but it's not good for us as far as bidders and the prices that come in.
No.
Correct. Well said.
Okay.
So hopefully,
I appreciate it.
No, great question.
so hopefully they finish a job, right, you know,
Yeah.
around the time that ours is coming out.
I'll lay a room.
All right.
The other positive, all joking aside, is that just so everyone recalls, our vote was, I believe it was 2 days before schools were actually closed in New York State. And so, I don't know, you know, I don't know that there were a lot of other capital projects that ended up
Making it to the table.
Right.
Yes.
So, Perhaps that helps us, perhaps it's
Yeah.
a moot point, but.
We will see.
Any other questions or comments?
No?
Thank you.
Okay.
Swimming pool.
They tried that here a couple of times and it was defeated, I hate to tell you.
Well, maybe it's time.
No,
No.
the liability alone is not worth the investment. Anyway, okay, I'll see everybody at the meeting on the 13th. That's next Tuesday.